Hi everyone, and welcome to another session of Poets Talk Politics. We've been doing this interlude for so this is the third episode, I believe, of the interlude that we've been doing. We've been talking to poetry critics, poetry scholars about, some new, some recent monographs like that were released in the last couple of years. And today we have Huda Fakhreddine from the University of Pennsylvania. We're going to be talking about her book, The Arabic Prose Poem. And on the panel with me, as usual, I have my friend and colleague, Elina Siltanen, who is currently university lecturer at the Department of English of the University of Turku. Her research focuses on contemporary American poetry, more specifically on the role of affect in reading complex literary texts. And her new project is entitled Affective Border Crossings, Reading for Human Nature Culture Connections in Anglophone Literatures. Recently, she has published an article on the connections between conceptualism and confessionalism in poetry in the Journal of Modern Literature, and on metamodernism and new sincerity in English studies. She has a double doctoral degree from the University of Turku and Luleå University of Technology in Sweden. And I am a full-time researcher at the Comparative Literature Institute of the University of Porto. I specialize in experimental American literature, in experimental American poetry and science studies, right? So I have a book coming out from Bloomsbury next year called American Experimental Poetry and the New Organic Form. And the project that I'm currently working on is on representations of aging in recent experimental American poetry. And so that's going to be like a book sometime in the future. But currently I'm working on putting out these two edited collections, one called Fear of Aging, which is going to be about like representations of aging in horror, fiction, and film, and another called Aging Experiments, which is going to be about aging in experimental writing, fantasy, and science fiction. So those two are going to be coming out sometime this year, later this year. And we can just say that Elina and I just put out an article that we wrote together that came out in English Studies about a very interesting conceptual project by Steve Zoltansky, right? So that's cool. That's what we've been doing. Apart from these sessions that we've been running like every month, we're actually going to do another one with someone from UPenn, so with Al Filreis, right, in May, about his book 1960. So yeah, so welcome, Huda. I'm just going to read your bio from your institutional page at UPenn. So Huda Fakhreddine's work focuses on modernist movements or trends in Arabic poetry and their relationship to Arabic literary tradition. She's interested in the role of the Arabic qasida. I hope I'm not mispronouncing that too badly, as a space for negotiating the foreign and the indigenous, the modern and the traditional, and its relationship to other poetic forms, such as the free verse poem and the prose poem. She is the author of Metapoiesis in the Arabic Tradition, which came out in 2015 from Brill, and the Arabic Prose Poem, Poetic Theory and Practice from Edinburgh University Press in 2021, which is the book that we're going to be talking about today. She is the co-translator of Lighthouse for the Drowning, The Sky That Denied Me, and Come Take a Gentle Stab, selections from Salim Barakat, which came out in 2021. Her translations of modern Arabic poems have appeared in Banipal, World Literature Today, Nimrod, Arab Lit Quarterly, and Asymptome, among others. Her book of creative nonfiction titled A Small Time Under a Different Sun was published in Beirut in 2019. She is co-editor of Middle Eastern Literatures and an editor of the Library of Arabic Literature. So welcome, Huda, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation to be here.
Thank you both for having me. I look forward to this conversation.
Thank you very much. So I wanted to start with this statement that you make, actually in the introduction, right? You're talking about chapter 1, I believe, and you say that the prose poem, which we'll eventually talk about what the prose poem is, and especially in relation to the free verse poem that you frequently compare it to. But you say that the prose poem is a subversive space from which literary, ideological, and social institutions are challenged, right? So I wanted to ask you to elaborate on that, and especially in relation to, or putting that side by side with another statement you make on page 28. And there I believe you're talking about Al-Hajj's manifesto, right? And you're saying that the prose poem is experimental and wants, I'm paraphrasing, I'm not like citing you verbatim, right? But you say, I believe, prose poem is experimental and wants to take Arabic poetry into a new world, right? So what are the implications, I guess, like the, as you say, ideological, social, and political implications of the prose poem as a subversive space?
So that's a big question. That is the book. I mean, my answer is the book, and it's a great question at the same time. So the Arabic prose poem, the prose poem might be problematic and controversial and provoking in every tradition, but especially in Arabic, it is more so because poetry in Arabic has for a long time, in this very long tradition, been marked with meter. Meter is the mark of poetry, even if critics always then rush to say meter doesn't make poetry, but in practice and in this long history, it has always been the fence that divided poetry from its others, poetry from not poetry, regardless of what will fall under each category. So it was not until 1960, which is not too long ago, that Arab poets decided to write texts and call them qasidas, which is the only word Arabic has for poem. It is a word that both means poem, any poem, but it also means a very specific kind of poem with formal requirements. And it is the archetypal Arabic poetic form that is traced back to pre-Islamic times and remained alive and vibrant and dynamic and transforming up until today. So there's this towering poetic form that has dominated Arabic poetic practice for centuries. And then not suddenly. So we like to present poetic movements and breaks as if they come out of the blue because it's more dramatic that way. But there's nothing sudden. There were precursors, there were attempts that go back as far as you will look for them. We can find a history or a prehistory, or we can identify a history for every intervention or break or revolution. So if we use the prose poem that was presented and theorized in 1960 as a lens and used it to read the Arabic poetic tradition, we will identify potential precursors, even if they were not written with that intention. So what's subversive about the prose poem that was presented in 1960 was that it was breaking away from all of that. And poetry has always been associated in Arabic history and Arabic culture and Arab culture as very close to what Arabness means. Poetry is an expression of this identity, right? Even if individuals will define it differently, but they use poetry as its purest or most eloquent expression. So that's why I say subversive towards institutions that are both social and political and ideological. So the revolution or the break that the prose poem presented in 1960 caught the attention of people outside the circles of poetry as well. It was thought as something, dangerous almost. It was described as a conspiracy against who we are. if we are the Arabs, for various reasons that I go into in the book.
Cool. I'll ask you some more questions about that later, but let me know. Give the floor to Elina.
Yeah, all right. Well, you wrote early on in the book that Western models did not have much of an impact on the modern Arabic poem, at least not after some early influences, but rather that it's a question of consciously refining and modifying form. But it might nevertheless be interesting to make some comparisons, which of course is not the same thing as influence anyway. And so you discussed the notion of indeterminacy as a dominant quality of the prose poem. And you wrote that you used the term indeterminacy in the same way that Marjorie Perloff used it in Poetics of Indeterminacy, her book from 40 years ago. So would you like to talk more about the possibilities of indeterminacy in Arabic poetry, and perhaps whether you see similarities between some of the poets that you discuss and maybe some of the people that Perloff discusses, like John Ashbery, for instance. I mean, I'm particularly interested in that because I've done some research on Ashbery, but anyway, if you can think of any comparisons or anything like that, that would be interesting to hear about.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'd like to comment first on influence. I say in the book that the Western influences were not as active, although if some of my colleagues who work on modern Arabic literature in general are listening in, their ears are going to perk up, because we always begin the story of modernism in Arabic by looking at Western influences, mainly English and French, and the role of translation, of poetry, and also of theory. And, you know, my problem with that is that it goes to an extreme and it presents Arabic modernism as if it were an imported product. And maybe in its early phases, it might have been, but those are the less successful phases, I think. So there's an adolescence of that movement that might have been taken aback or mesmerized by achievements in French and English especially. And remember, there's a power dynamic there between Arabic and these languages. They are colonial languages. So there are generations of poets and writers and critics who studied in colonial institutions, and, you know, that must have affected the way they looked at themselves and at their traditions, especially at the turn of the 20th century or the first half of the 20th century. So we cannot deny Western influence, of course. And the prose poem, I mean, the term itself is a translation from French, and Suzanne Bernard's book was seminal in just introducing the prose poem as a modern framework and as something, as making it into an abstraction that then becomes an issue, a problem, or a cause. So I'm not denying Western influences, but I say the claim I make in the book is that these influences or these attempts at imitation were not as productive. What was really productive and developed modern Arabic poetic forms, the free verse poem and the prose poem, was really in experiences or experiments that intervened or engaged with the tradition through these lenses. That even rejection is a very productive relationship with the tradition that a poet can have, if that rejection is based on a true and intimate knowledge of that which is being rejected. So I think, so my claim in this book is that the prose poem really developed into several trends in schools. It's not one thing, and that's why, you know, my choice of poets is something I'd like to comment on. The book is not a survey. I could have studied 5 different poets and came to similar conclusions, or maybe a whole set of different conclusions that would still have been valid, because this is a space for experimentation. And here is where I come to indeterminacy. I mean, the idea of the prose poem as a tool to shake up categories that had been relatively rigid in this tradition is probably one of its most important successes or achievements. The fact that it shakes up or blurs a relatively fixed definition of what poetry is, and it really opens the door or poses the question of what is poetry in Arabic, or even more unsettling, what can be poetry in Arabic. So we're opening up the parameters of this genre or this form or this space to its extreme. It's opening up entirely, and that's where the scandalous and the unsettling feelings towards the prose poem come. So the poets that Marjorie Perloff studies, especially her interest in language poets, and I know that you've had a conversation with Charles Bernstein here. I mean, these are interesting poets who, you know, want to create events inside the language, you know, where the poem is not really concerned with communicating something or commenting on something or even making meaning at all, but it's interested in intervening in language, its imagination, its affect, its consequence, its impact, its sound. And we find some prose poets who decided to go in that route, to you know, engage almost forcefully with the language and to resist making meaning, as opposed to, you know, and that's a way of challenging the more romantic or traditional view of poetry as an expression of something. You know, meaning and form both become shaky categories or things that are open to investigation. And let's look at what we mean by meaning and what we mean by form and what are their potentials moving forward.
Thank you, Huda. So I'd like to actually go back to this idea of like you said it like right now, but like on page 7, you say that the absence of meter is what made this poetry scandalous, right? And so the like when I read that, right, like the immediate I mean, of course, like being, you know, being Portuguese and having a background in you know, American experimental poetry, right? This sort of idea seems interesting, right? In the sense that, you know, why would such a like small thing cause such a stir, right? But then, as you point out, right, like as you just said, right, it is like a big deal, right? Because it shook it you know, it went against, I guess, the way that poetry had been done in the past, right? In the Arabic world, right? And I was actually thinking about like the way that my students, it's very interesting that I teach a class on comparative poetics, right? And I mostly like you know, lean on the kind of poetry that I study and that I like, right? So it ends up being, you know, I end up, you know, showing the kids, you know, some Frank O'Hara, some William Carlos Williams. And it's interesting to see that they also see that sort of poetry, right? Which to me, and I guess to, I think all of us, right, sitting here, it's pretty innocuous, right? Like it's pretty, you know, it's not radical in any like, you know, it's not Charles Bernstein, right? Or, you know, Ron Silliman and whatever, right? But I got you know, still a lot of kids even here, right, saying, you know, yeah, but I don't really see that as poetry, right? Like Frank O'Hara and, you know, William Carlos Williams, you know, Gertrude Stein. That, I mean, Gertrude Stein is of course a more extreme case, but you know, and just because it's not, as you I think we're sort of saying, it's not like self-expression, it's not you know, rhyme. It's not in meter, right? And so these things still are very much the idea that people, I think in general, have of what a poem should be like, right? It's not just in, you know, the Arabic context, but in general, right? I think the average reader still has this idea of what a poem should be like, right? So yeah, and I don't know, this is not really a question, but I wanted you to kind of comment on this idea of you know,
of meter being
absence of meter, right, being, you know, radical, being a radical idea, I guess.
Yeah, thank you for taking us back to that. It's an important point, and you're right to say that it might sound silly for us today to say, you know, the absence of meter is scandalous and revolutionary and subversive and groundbreaking. And many poets writing in Arabic today, and might I add, the majority of them write prose poems now. So the prose poem has become the form. And poets who are in their 30s or their 20s who write prose poems today in the Arab world don't see themselves as breaking away or subversive or, you know, crossing any boundaries that should not be crossed. But the purpose of my goal in the book was to show what it meant when it first happened and how loaded meter was up until 1960. And it's not because Arabic is hung up on meter in any specific way, or maybe it is, but add to that the experiment that we call modernism that began in the late 40s and presented an alternative Arabic poem, which we refer to in Arabic as the free verse poem, or قصيدة التفعيلة or الشعر الحر. We borrow the term from French and English, but we mean by it something entirely different. So the Arabic prose free verse poem that came to be in the late 40s was a variation on the classical meters or rules of prosody. It was not free, it was relatively free. So even freedom that was theorized, poetic freedom that was theorized in the late 40s by people like Nazik al-Malaika, Adonis himself, who was part of the pioneering group of the free verse movement, but then again, a pioneer of the prose poem, by Abdul Wahab al-Bayati and the Iraqi school, as well as some other poets around the Arab world who presented the free verse poem as the modern Arabic poem, but it still had some consideration of meter. And the thinking there was that meter is integral to our expectations of poetry in Arabic. So even if it's not the magic ingredient, but it's, as you said, what a reader expects. There's some kind of element that, you know, satisfies a reader when they prepare themselves to listen to a poem. There are some, you know, elements of of reception that also help in defining the thing being received. And in this case, meter is that thread that connected the poem written in 1949 to a poem written in pre-Islamic times. So the prose poem in 1960 deliberately wanted to break that expectation as well. It wanted to shock, and it wanted to just rub it in the reader's nose. Yes, prepare yourself for a qasida, a poem, but we're going to present to you something completely unexpected. And I think that is part of the meaning. So when we think of what the point of this poetry is, one of its goals or meanings was that it shocked and disappointed or upset expectations like that. I'm not sure if I answered your call to go back, but I understand this. You know, why are we so hung up on meter? And it's also maybe helpful to remind listeners and ourselves that people still write qasidas, traditional monometered, mono-rhymed in the Arab world today. It hasn't died, it hasn't gone away. So these poetic forms coexist, and I think they gain meaning from that, the tensions that exist between them today as they coexist in the 21st century.
But it's, I mean, it's not going to be a question. I'll let Elina go, but just to comment on that it's very interesting. Like, I mean, as you point out in the last chapter, right? How it's become, right? How the prose poem has become like ubiquitous and like it's no longer shocking. And as you just said, right, like young people, you know, write in that sort of form today, and it's that's what the expectations are in a way, right? And you go back to that idea a lot, I think, throughout the book, and you know, in different contexts, that it's, you know, even when you're in the chapter about Mahmoud Darwish, you know, you point out that, you know, he wanted to like just not you know, keep writing the same way, right? Because, you know, that's sort of the point, right? Is to go against the you know, what's expected, right? And that does have some I guess, even the case that I reference, right, the like of my students thinking that, you know, this sort of poetry is, you know, mind-blowing to them, and they reject it, right? Like, again, like it's very interesting to me, the idea that you would reject like some really innocuous poetry like what I mentioned as not being poetry, right? And that being offensive to people in some sort of way, right? And that definitely, there's something political and ideological going on there. So that's cool. So I can definitely see like why you think that this would be shocking and scandalous and whatnot. Okay, so Elina.
Yes, so our discussion series, of course, is called Poets Talk Politics, and while it doesn't maybe seem to me that your book is primarily or obviously about political poetry, I can still see that this way of thinking about form in poetry can have repercussions for politics as well. For example, in your chapter about the poet Salim Barakat, you write that, and I quote, "It seems as if poetry in Barakat's project is a deliberate occlusion of meaning behind the veil of language intentionally textured and thickened beyond recognition." So do you want to talk more about what political possibilities this way of using language that occludes meaning might have?
Yes, and that's another great question. So on the surface, the prose poem does not, well, it actually openly claimed to be apolitical when it was first launched in the journal Share that was founded by Adonis and Yusuf Al-Khal in the late 50s. This group presented itself as apolitical, but that's probably the most political stance one can take in the Arab world in the 50s, to say I am apolitical. When the world is burning around you, you say, well, I'm going to sit in this corner and write poetry for poetry's sake, and there's nothing more political than that. And Salim Barakat is a good segue because the prose poem was then picked up by minorities, ethnic and religious. It was thought of as the subversive, the marginal form that it indirectly found a space for itself to be politically critical and revolutionary in a way that wasn't openly committed to a political party or engaged in political polemics. With Salim Barakat, who is not an Arab, and he deliberately insists on presenting himself as somebody who writes in Arabic, but he's a Kurd. So being Kurdish, growing up in Syria, there are many concerns there that he channels. He does not openly politically talk about them in his poetry, but he channels them in a very interesting, intriguing, unique relationship with the Arabic language. And when you read Salim Barakat, you mentioned, Elina, in your work that you're interested in complex texts and their affect. Salim Barakat's texts are very complex, and their affect is sometimes debilitating for the reader because they are difficult, quote unquote. I'm not sure what we mean by difficult when we describe a poetic text. You know, it's not a very productive adjective, but they're daunting, they're intimidating, they require a lot of effort. And you, by the end of it, the journey, regardless of how much effort you exert, you don't end up figuring out what the point of them was. Any meaning is also not straightforward, but this engagement, this confrontation that sometimes has been described as violent with the Arabic language and its grammar becomes an indirect channeling of, you know, the position of the minority, somebody who's always marginalized socially and politically. Then this is the revenge. The revenge becomes or expresses itself or manifests itself in this reclaiming of grammar, especially in a language that is so old and has been alive for so many centuries and has in itself a daunting history. But Mahmoud Darwish is also an interesting case, and I'd like to comment on that chapter because reviewers have always had issue with it. And I've heard people say, well, why did you even include Mahmoud Darwish? He was never a prose poet. Or they think that I misunderstood, or I'm thinking of him as a prose poet. I think that's exactly why I included him, because here is a poet who all of his life openly said, I write the free verse poem. To me, poetry has to be metered in some way, even if it's a loose meter, a variation of meter. But he would turn around and write these very poetic texts and would call them something else, would call them diaries or just texts. So this was something who was walking the tightrope, or whatever the metaphor is, between the categories that are being shaken up or blurred by the intervention of the prose poem. He was very tempted by it. He wrote about it. He got into arguments about it with other poets in cultural pages and newspapers, which got a little bit personal at some point. But he he, as you mentioned, found in it a space to challenge his audience's expectations of him. It was an element that pushed him to experiment until the end of his life. He never settled into his fame or into his reputation as probably one of the most well-known and widely read poets in the Arabic language, but through his engagement critically, theoretically with the Arabic prose poem, he continued to experiment and to push the envelope of his own work and his audience's expectations until the very end. And when it comes to political engagement, I mean, Mahmoud Darwish is probably one of the most politically associated poets, with a political issue, Palestine and Mahmoud Darwish. But through his late style experimentations, if you want to call them that, which I think are motivated or triggered or even maybe just inspired by the idea of poetry in a different form, poetry in new means, he commented on his own political reputation as well. I mean, he would inside poems say, well, not everything I say has to be political. Not every metaphor I present has to end up equaling Palestine. I mean, this self-reflection, I think, is a symptom of that open space of experimentation that the prose poem allows, even for poets who do not write it, even poets who critiqued it or engaged with it from a distance, like Darwish.
No, yeah, that's really cool. And one thing I found really interesting about what you say there, like there's I believe you go into this at the end of the chapter on Darwish, you keep going back to this question of like, what is poetry, right? Like this is what these authors are all like testing is what is poetry, right? And you're here like paraphrasing Darwish or I believe paraphrasing, not citing, and I'm going to paraphrase you, right? You say that poetry is what drives us to say that this is poetry, no further proof needed, right? So that's really interesting because it is basically what you're basically saying. It's the reader or the context, right? Or as Charles Bernstein would say, right, the timing, right? What makes a poem is the timing, right? Is you saying that it is a poem, and that's really, I think, still a pretty radical gesture even today, right? Like, I mean, both Elina and I'm sure, Huda, that you are familiar with, the developments in, recent American poetry, right? It's all very interesting and confusing. Like, why would, I don't know. And we'll go, because I know that Elina has some questions for you about conceptualism and whatnot. Right, like why would you like look at Kenny Goldsmith's Traffic and call it a poem, right, or something like that, right? So that really takes some mental gymnastics to get there. Like, I wanted to ask you a question about your seventh chapter, which is on I correct my pronunciation, please. Wadi Sadeh.
Yes, Wadi Sadeh. Yes.
Yeah, no, sorry. So you present his poetry as being very much as very, very destructive and very cynical and turned turned to itself, I guess, right? So questioning itself and not being able to, right, or be the poetry being about like this inability for language to be expressive or to communicate, right? So yeah, I wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit on why this would be like, this is more again, this is again maybe just a duplication of what Elina asked you before, or a repetition of what she asked you before, but why would this sort of like very hesitant, very and you as you put it, right, like it's a poetry of silence, right, that sort of sees in silence like greater potential than in verbalization, than in speech. Why would this be like, again, like political or disruptive or subversive in a way.
Because here I'm thinking of your students. This would be something that your students would reject, or their equivalent, a group of young people in a class or any other setting presented with a poem by Wadiyas Hadi. It would agitate them. It would annoy them to call it a poem, because it just upsets all their expectations in terms of tone, in terms of imagery, in terms of layout on the page. Sometimes his poems are very short, 3-4 lines. Sometimes they go on for 5 pages of block paragraphs. The idea is that it taunts the reader. You want poetry, well, here you go. This is something entirely different. And sometimes the punchline or the takeaway from Wadiyas Hadi's work is that it's better to not say anything at all. Yes, poetry is a laudable thing. It's an admirable thing to seek, but just not doing it at all might be even nobler. This idea that, language is a trap, and the purpose here, just unlike Salim Barakat, where language is this veil or this barricade almost that he sits behind, with Wadiyas Hadi, it's something that one has to survive. And if we use it correctly, then we arrive at silence and no need to say anything. Silence is the most eloquent thing. But to go back to your introduction before turning to Wadiyas Hadi, I think the problem or the problem is, I use that word positively. I mean, the issue or the matter that is intriguing and provoking and exciting about the prose poem is that it also posed very clearly the distinction between poem and poetry. Poem as opposed to poetry. So while we are not going to disagree too much that poetry is open and things we like and admire or baffle us or affect us deeply, we call them poetry. So poetry is a critical category. It's not technical. We expect the poem to be technical. So here in this prose poem project in Arabic, these two things are blurred. So Wadiyas Hadi, for example, when asked in interviews, what do you think of the polemics of the prose poem or the arguments, the heated debate? He says, I could not care less. I do not write a prose poem. I do not write a poem. Call whatever you want, what I write, whatever you want. And he sometimes comes up with the suggestion of an open text. Call them open texts. It's not, his dissociation from the argument and his divestment from all the labels, it seems as if he's withdrawing, but I think there are political valences to that, to saying that, I'm going to remove myself from the argument, but continue to write subversive and agitating texts. And, whether I call them that or not, they're being presented as poetry. And it falls upon the reader then to define poetry, to define the poem each and every time. When faced with a single text, these questions rise to the surface as very urgent. And for the informed reader, the tradition always looms large. If this is a poem, if I like this text and I interact with it, it touches me, it pushes me to call it a poetry, then what do I do with all these formal poems that rhyme and are metered and that I also love and call poetry? How do I reconcile that? So the prose poem, again, another achievement that it has done, or another of its achievements, is that the reading itself becomes a critical and creative. Reading or receiving becomes a critical and creative act as well. And the reader is very much involved in defining poetry and the poem and deciding whether these texts are going to be rejected or accepted, going back to your students in the class.
No, and let me go back to them again, because like this does seem to be so two things. First, this sort of poetry that doesn't seem to lead anywhere, right? It's not useful, right? It's not rewarding, as you were saying, right? Like you expect the poem to give you some sort of insight or some philosophical whatever enlightenment or something, but it doesn't, right? Like this sort of, from what I understand in the poems that you used there, right? Like they do seem to be a little like open-ended, and they don't seem to say much, right? They suggest, maybe they entice, but they don't really lead anywhere. But this is really, I mean, I find it really interesting. But again, to go back to my student, my hypothetical, student
They're
here.
becoming very real as time passes.
Well, so I remember I was having this conversation in class, and what they were saying, like what this student and some of the other kids were saying is that, sure, that's all very nice, but that sort of poetry that, that is very, pointless, not rewarding, it's for academics, right? Like, it's not for the common person. It's not for the, the everyday, your average reader, right? But you seem to be saying that that's what's expected, these days for a young person to write, right? And they're well received, and they're, so that doesn't seem to be an issue, right? Like in the Arabic context, at least, right?
I don't want to be understood as if I'm saying that, poetry has a huge, wide audience in the Arab world as well, as is the case everywhere. I mean, fewer and fewer people are reading poetry, right? And I don't know if the academics are the ones who reads the poetry. I don't know, maybe the poets themselves. It has become a monologue. But maybe part of the appeal of this poetry is that pointlessness has become a shared and common experience. I mean, look at the world we live in today. Many of the poems that I address in the last chapter of the book by younger poets who started their careers after 2000 deal with, in the spirit of Huda Fakhreddine, who questions the possibility or the abilities of language to communicate anything. We see younger poets turning to the internet, the language as it appears in the newfound media, in texting, in emailing, and how that breaks down, how that it loses its references in one language and one way of thinking. And the pointlessness then does become a relevant point to be made. It's not in vain. It does express an experience, or it does resonate with experiences that we all share. And then it ties in with migration and diaspora and exile and the feeling of uprootedness that has become a shared experience as well. So so there are ways of bringing it back to a general audience, and whether the poets intended it or not, finding meaning in it and expression of experience in a roundabout way.
Elina, because Elina wants to ask you a question, I know, about those poets that you talk about in the last chapter.
Yes. So in the last full chapter of the book, you write about, for example, the poet Samer Abu Hawash. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, but you wrote that he has engaged a lot with American poetry of the 20th century. He mentioned poets like Elizabeth Bishop and William Carlos Williams, for instance. But something that I found particularly intriguing is the poem that you quoted, refining search words, which uses found material. So a conceptual poem, like the kind of poetry that many American poets also have written. And again, I'm making comparisons to American poetry because that's the thing I know. That's the thing that I've done research on. But you don't really mention the influence of more recent American poets. But would you say ultimately, is this poetry different from the kind of conceptual poetry written in the USA? And perhaps also, do you think that Arabic prose poetry is developing or has developed into a very different direction from what's happening in the West in some ways?
So how would you define conceptual poetry, Elina?
Well, something that uses a concept, but of course, a lot of the stuff that I've read is something that maybe uses found material and doesn't necessarily have like this kind of like a single voice that speaks, and is not so expressive of one person's experience and things like that.
Yeah, but is there a concept that appears or is foregrounded more than other concepts. And in my mind, does the conceptual poem, is it really concerned with the concept of itself, of poetry? Does it in a way always turn back and question what poetry is and what a poem can be? Maybe, would you agree with that? Because I think poetry does that. So if you want to see that as a connection with developments in American poetry, and again, let me just make this comment before I answer or attempt to answer your question. The reason why I insisted on arriving where I arrived in this book is probably a reaction to some practices in the field of Arabic literary studies in the US and in Europe in general, and then get imported, taken back into the Arab world, where, you know, we rarely arrive at the present moment of Arabic poetry. We keep studying, especially in academic circles, modernism that ends in, you know, the 1960s or 1950. We ignore that the Arabic language and the Arabic poetic practice are still going on, and they're part of the world, and they are contemporary, and they're not backward or out of time, or they don't require extensive expertise to be connected with. They are part of this world. So that was part of the message of that book, that I'm interested in studying poetic practice from today, from this moment, looking backward to an immediate history and a longer history, thinking of the entirety of the Arabic poetic tradition. Yes, that was the first one. The second characteristic, or the second theme that runs through the last chapter, is translation. Many of these young poets, Samir Abu Hawash or Julian Haji, and I call them young, but there are many much younger poets writing today. But many of them they dabble in translation. They're either well-established translators, or they read in translation, or they are bilingual or multilingual, as most people are in the world today. So the fact that their references are not only Arabic is very intriguing, and it shows itself in their writing. So the poem that they write in the Arabic language is not always necessarily only an Arabic poem. It does have echoes of other languages and other registers of Arabic as well, and other media, not just the written word, sounds and you know, TV and the language of the digital age. So yes, conceptual poetry is a very relevant framework to study some of this writing, especially if the concept that's being approximated or played around with is, again, expectation of poetry and the poem. So that poem that you referred to, I mean, you can see how triggering it might be, exhilarating and triggering at the same time, when somebody says, let's do this Google search and then curate the results into a poem. Right. And if you go through it, it might be meaningless, but it actually might have all the meanings all at once for you as a reader to deal with. This is it. This is language in today's moment, in today's age, broken down, probably full of grammatical errors, but that's the way it is, right? This is the language of our times. Broken down into ingredients for you to make up. And so there are many concepts that are being played around with and presented to the reader. But I'd like to see, in the context of that book, the poet deliberately asking the question of what is poetry and what can be poetry in the Arabic context specifically. So he's bringing all of his multilingual, multi-experiential, diverse informing elements, and then placing them deliberately in the continuum of the Arabic poetic practice and saying, what are we going to do with this now? Where are we going to place it? How are we going to package it? What will we call it? Poem, poetry, text, or something entirely different?
Well, we were actually talking before you joined the channel, that we were a bit confused as to where you stood in relation to this sort of poetry, right? Because there's a statement that you end the book, I believe, or towards the end of the book, on page, I got the page number here, so it's on page 248, right? You say, this generation's writings in Arabic may also at times reflect the loss of footing, a linguistic apathy, and maybe sometimes incompetence, right? And then you say also that they are like thinking about the tradition, but not with the tradition. So we were wondering, like, where does Huda stand in, like, does she like this sort of poetry, or is she like against it or something like that? Like
Again, yeah, that's a great, thank you so much for asking. I've been waiting how many years the book came out for somebody to ask me this question, and you did it. Thank you so much. I'm glad that you're not clear where I stand. And I was very conscious and aware of not, expressing an opinion outright. But here in this intimate conversation that everybody's listening in on, let me tell you that personally, I was always, I steered clear away from the prose poem when I was working on my first book. And my first book is grounded in a study of Abbasid poetry. So 8th, 9th, 10th century, a movement that is modernizing and experimental and had its enemies and was described as corrupting of Arab taste back then. Although its poets wrote in form and in meter, they did not break anything, they did not reject anything, right? They revolutionized the qasida from within and were seen as scandalous and dangerous, and many of them were executed. These were times where criticism had different expressions, not just bad reviews. So my taste personally, I would say that I have expectations that are in line with, I'm not going to call them traditional, because the word traditional has a bad reputation. It means something archaic and old. I enjoy the qasida, the classical qasida, and I enjoy some of my favorite poets and poems are free verse poems that succeed in employing meter and rhyme in unexpected ways that are meaningful. They're not just tagged on or imposed. And this is why I was very suspicious of the prose poem when I decided to turn to it. It lured me, it attracted me as a critical question, but I did not have favorite prose poets that I would sit alone and read willingly. But I learned a lot writing this book, and I discovered some astounding writing, texts that I would still go back to, single texts. Yeah, I'm not going to say I have a favorite poet, because I mean, when you open up your practice like that as a poet, you are supposed to reconcile with failures and successes when you're experimenting like this. So my final word on this is that the prose poem as this open space has the potential of great poetry, but it doesn't always. There are great risks. So far in the Arabic experience or the Arabic experiment, I think the achievement of the prose poem, and I said this in the book, I'll say it again, is that its ability to pose critical questions poignantly and productively. Has it produced poems that will live on forever? I'm not sure yet. I don't know. But I know that the poems that are written, or the texts that are written, reflect urgent elements of our time. They tell us a lot about the life of this language in the 21st century, this language that has a long memory of itself, and it's adjusting, it keeps adjusting and transforming. So we have a lot to learn from this poetry, even when it doesn't intend to teach us anything, like with Saadi's work. But yes. And I think we will learn a lot from the prose poem about Arabic poetry, from its failures and its successes alike. Does that answer your question? Not exactly, right?
No, it does. I think so. No, I see where you're going with, like, do we know, if these poems are gonna be considered like, great poems a couple of generations from now? Yeah, I see what you're saying, right?
But let me add to that. I mean, what are great poems? I mean, what defines great poetry? I mean, that great poetry in itself is a problematic phrase that one best leaves alone and not use with a lot. Really. It might be misleading more than it's productive. But let me add to my question, to my answer to where I stand. One resort while writing this book, first an attempt to remain objective, and even the poetry that I personally would not like, I thought was an opportunity for a critical reading and for, you know, pressing questions to be asked. Another criterion was language. If I were to approach these poems as linguistic events, what do they achieve? Where do they succeed and where do they fail? And this opens up the potentials of the prose poem greatly onto so many questions and discoveries. And what happens, and if you're aware of the situation of Arabic, people write in a language different from the one they speak. This is a situation we call diaglossia. So even Fusha, the written language, has a reputation or an affect of being old and archaic. And here are young poets, or just poets in this project, writing, using it in unexpected ways. So that is also a consideration when identifying successes and failures. How is language employed in this form or this genre that is so new and subversive? We go back to that word in the memory and the history of the Arabic language. And I feel like I have to add one more thing, the idea that also opens up, so because we are writing in this, what we call Fusha, or the written language, it also allows or opens the window to look at other, as I mentioned very early on, potential precursors for the prose poem. So the prose poem becomes a lens for discovering the very long and rich tradition of Arabic prose, pre-modern Arabic prose, where writers were not really concerned with labeling their writing as anything. Yeah, it was adab, it was literature, but we find in it nuggets that now prose poets and theorists of the prose poem will hold on to and say, well, look, we've been doing this for a long time, so we do have a history, we are legitimate in this language and in this tradition. So maybe my final sentence on where I stand, I think the prose poem is an invaluable critical lens. It is very productive and fruitful. It is inspiring for writers because it puts on them the burden of defining the parameters of poetry and the poem, but it also opens up the Arabic prose and poetry tradition onto endless new readings. Maybe I'm happy with that answer.
Oh, cool. No, okay, so maybe like one final question. I actually didn't know that you had written your first book on Abbasid poetry. So that's really cool. So that you know relates to maybe the last question that I wanted to. I think, Elina, you don't have any more questions, right? Do you?
Well, only the one, or where you're going to ask that, going back to the sentence that you quoted earlier about the first generations, right? How about the well, sorry. So earlier, yeah, João, you quoted the sentence that first generations writings in Arabic may also at times reflect a loss of footing, a linguistic apathy, and maybe sometimes incompetence. So I thought that's an interesting statement, and I wanted to hear whether you have any thoughts on where does that come from? Why the apathy? Are the reasons poetic or something beyond it, or what?
Definitely poetic apathy. Many of these young poets express disdain and boredom and lack of inspiration when it comes to the way they receive the tradition or their immediate predecessors. So we can see or hear a political position in that apathy. But also much of the writing that is published in the Arab world today under the heading of prose poem does include a lot of very weak texts. Because remember, in a tradition that had such strict rules, and poetry required some level of skill, when you take that away, it opens the door to claims, not poetry, claims of poetry, and it's perceived as easier to write a prose poem, whereas in fact it is much more difficult to write a true prose poem that takes upon itself the reader to define the very basics. So the game, it had its rules, you had to learn them in order to play. Now there's a game with no rules, but you have to make rules before you play. You just can't play without any rules at all. So I worry, so that expression is probably a reflection of my frustration sometimes with just the thinking that poetry is anything can be poetry. The fact that now it is easier or less, that it has no requirements, it has no linguistic or formal or even musical requirements whatsoever. And that, yeah, it can then devolve into something that is nothing as opposed to everything, I guess.
And that actually leads me to, I mean, I'm sorry, I keep bringing up my student, right? And that leads me to this idea that I think was also raised in class about this sort of, you know, experimental poetry that like we like, that Elina and I teach, being, you know, just new for the sake of newness, right? And that seems to be sort of what you're saying, right? Like this apathy, right? In the sense of, you know, it's the cult of the new, right? That people want to, you know, write in a way that they maybe feel is, you know, maybe fresher and maybe without less constraints, right? And yet you, in your opinion, right, from what I take from what you said before, right, you don't feel that they engage with the tradition, and that's itself a political positioning, right? So okay, my final question to you would concern then your book, which I didn't know was about medieval poetry. So that, because you in chapter 2, right, you sort of trace the you know, the origins, I guess, of the prose poem back to even pre-Islamic times, right? You say that, you know, sure, we may think that this is like, you know, something, you know, that just came, you know, just appeared in the 1960s, but actually it has this much longer tradition of like self-reflection, you know, self-criticism and whatnot, that you see as a sort of undercurrent in Arabic poetry in general, I guess. So would you like to close with something maybe about your first book, about your, you know, your previous
But not the first book, maybe the second chapter that you just referred to. These are not origins of the prose poems. The prose poem is an issue or an abstract idea or an abstraction or a concept that was introduced in 1960, and it wanted to present itself as unprecedented. So my purpose in the second chapter was to show that is an ideological presentation of it being unprecedented. In fact, the Arabic tradition does include many examples, as you said, that go back to pre-Islamic times, where writing happened between categories. And the fence or the divisions were not absolute. And we have writing that is outside of meter, that is in prose, that is highly musical and very rhetorical. And the Quran comes to mind, yeah, but that is a category on its own, and it really complicates the conversation and makes it much more interesting. But before the Quran, we have pre-Islamic samples of pre-Islamic prose that have survived. The rhymed prose, again, rhymed prose exists throughout. And then we have philosophical and Sufi writing that is, you know, again, meaning becomes occluded or deferred, and language takes the foreground as a screen, and rhetorical devices used in prose are prominent. So the idea in the second chapter is to show that once we want to, literary history is fiction, really, because it creates things that are not really accurate, and it presents them in a more absolute way than they really are. Usually things are much more nuanced and rounded, and on their edges are much more rounded than we like to make them seem, especially when we talk about literary periods in literature. So this is a period that ends here and begins here, as if the divisions are sharp. They never are. So the point of that chapter was to show that there are potential precursors. So this is a doorway for prose poets who think of themselves as unprecedented in their tradition to look at what could have been. This is a potential history that will only reveal itself in the aftermath of the prose poem as a critical lens. So we develop it, we theorize it, and then we use it as a reading tool. It can uncover for us sites of interest in the tradition, many of them actually, that will enrich it and maybe ground it. And if we're going to worry about legitimacy, maybe give it that, but that's not an issue. It doesn't have to. It could be an illegitimate poetic form, and that maybe will give it more power. But its critical dimension is highlighted in that second chapter. It's the fact that it uncovers a diverse range of writing that existed in the tradition or in pre-modern times that we are blind to, because we tend to look at the past in a very narrow and regimented way. You know, we want to see, and this is where the tyranny of history falls on poetry. We try to we compartmentalize it and package it in ways that are non-poetic when we look back at it historically or from a historicist perspective. So connecting to the first book, I mean, my attempt in the first book was to uncover or to highlight the experimentalization and the great revolution that happened in Abbasid poetry by poets like Abu Tammam and al-Buhturi and Bashar ibn Burd. And these are poets that today are the canon. They are what people study in school, what people sometimes memorize. But these were poets that really they swerved away from the status quo and from the establishment of poetry and criticism of their age, and were attacked on moral grounds sometimes because poetry is so important and central in Arab life. And many of them, as I mentioned earlier, paid a very big price and lost their lives for writing poetry that was not what we expected, not what we think poetry should be. Yeah, so there is a thread, and this second book is really a second movement following the first one, in the same line of, you know, questioning what is poetry, what can be poetry, and what can it do? What can poetry do?
Yeah, that's very nice. That's a very nice way of wrapping up our conversation as well. So thank you very much, Huda, for coming. And I hope people, you know, even if they didn't watch us live, the video will stay on our channel and on our page, our Facebook page. So, you know, hopefully.
Well, thank you both very much.
So thank you very much. No, thank you.
Thank you for the great questions, especially about where I stand. I'll work on
thank you.
From now
very
on.
Interesting.
Thank you. And have the rest of a good day, since you're starting your day over there, right? We're
midday.
Going to bed soon here, so have a nice rest, good rest of your day, and nice to meet you. Bye.
Take care. Bye.